"Release my father, and I will help you stand." This was not a promise from a fairy tale. It was uttered in a stuffy courtroom by an 8-year-old girl to Judge Adrian Cole, a man who had been in a wheelchair for 15 years. At first, her innocent words were dismissed as an absurd joke, drawing laughter from the entire room. But then, they slowly transformed into a challenge, a beacon of hope, and finally, a prophecy, because on that fateful day, the bitter judge in his wheelchair had no idea that the seemingly childish promise was the one truth that could free him from the prison he had built for himself for so long. This courtroom was a far cry from the usual solemn halls of justice. It was a makeshift space, set up in the main lobby of a disused military hospital, a relic of a forgotten war. The dusty scent of old age mingled with the faint, ghostly smell of antiseptic. A rickety ceiling fan whirred overhead, its rhythmic squeak a tired sigh stirring the thick air, but providing no relief from the heat. Dim light struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, painting faint, scarred streaks on the floor. Everything, from the wobbly judge's bench to the worn-out wooden pews, felt weary and decayed. This was Judge Adrian Cole's kingdom. At 55, he still carried the broad shoulders of a warrior, but his gaze had turned to ice. Those steel-cold eyes looked down on a world he could only observe from his seated height. The sleek, black wheelchair was a paradox, a throne for an authoritative judge and an inescapable prison for a man. Every morning, he wheeled himself into this room, a ritual so familiar it had become numb. He knew every crack in the floor, every chip in the paint. This place, like him, was a remnant of a war long over. On the oak table, next to the heavy gavel, was an object no one dared to ask about. It was a clear glass block, and inside, a single, mangled bullet sat still like a beetle frozen in amber. It was a silent reminder of that fateful day on the battlefield, the day that had stolen his legs and his faith in human kindness. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would unconsciously turn the block, watching the light refract through it, as if trying to find something he had lost in that distorted past. Below him, the prosecutor was wrapping up his closing statement. His voice was steady, filled with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, as if the verdict had already been decided. "And so, Your Honor, Daniel Cross is not just a lone drug dealer. He is a link, a crucial piece in the organized crime syndicate we're working to dismantle, a cancer on our society. A fitting sentence for the defendant will serve as a stark warning to those who might consider following this path." Adrian barely heard a word. To him, Daniel Cross was just like the hundreds of defendants who had stood at that railing, a name in a file, a statistic, just another weary face in a world full of the weak and the misguided. He was a criminal, and Adrian's job was to stamp that truth with quick, emotionless finality. Daniel stood there in his faded work clothes, his calloused hands clenched. He looked small and out of place in this powerful room, like a lamb about to be sacrificed. "Do you have anything you would like to say in your defense?" Adrian's voice was dry, grating like metal on metal. Daniel looked up, his desperate eyes meeting the judge's. "Your Honor, I'm innocent. They set me up. I'm just a worker. I have a little girl I need to take care of. Please, believe me." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of irritation crossing his brow. Children, always children. Guilt always found a pitiful excuse. He had heard these words so many times, they had become meaningless noise. It only made him despise their weakness. He reached for the wooden gavel. Its weight in his hand was familiar. It was the only power he had left, the power to decide the fate of others when his own had long been sealed. He lifted the gavel, the dim light from the windows glinting off its polished surface. Daniel bowed his head, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had just fallen upon him. He knew it was over. Click. But it wasn't the gavel striking the wood. The sound was sharper, more distinct. It was the latch of the courtroom door. The heavy oak door at the back of the room creaked open. A small figure slipped through the gap and bolted inside. The two guards at the door, startled, rushed to stop her, but the girl was too quick. Her long dark hair, neatly braided in pigtails, flew behind her. She ran straight down the central aisle, her tiny footsteps echoing strangely in the sudden silence of the room. The entire courtroom froze, everyone turning to stare. Daniel looked up, his face pale with horror. "Maya, what are you doing here? Go back." But the girl didn't seem to hear her father. She had one single purpose. She stopped directly in front of the judge's bench, so small she was almost swallowed by the imposing piece of furniture, but she held her head high, her eyes clear and unafraid, looking directly into Adrian's icy gaze. Instead of crying or pleading like other children, she took a deep breath and said something that made time in the room stop. "Release my father, and I will help you stand." Maya's promise hung in the heavy courtroom air before it fell, shattering into a stunned silence. It was a thick, palpable silence, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Then it broke. First, a stifled snort from the prosecutor's table, then a muffled giggle, poorly concealed, from someone in the public gallery. Soon, it rippled out like a wave, not of malice, but of absolute disbelief. The young defense lawyer quickly bowed his head to hide a smirk. The entire courtroom looked at the girl as if she had just declared she could fly to the moon on paper wings. But Maya did not flinch. She stood there, small and resolute, like a tiny statue, oblivious to the undercurrent of mockery spreading around her. For Adrian Cole, this was no joke. It was a humiliation. A hot flush of shame and pure rage rose to his face. The greatest tragedy of his life, the pain he had worn like a suit of armor for 15 years, was now being mocked by a child, right in his own kingdom. The order, the discipline, the control he had built to protect himself, all of it was collapsing before this innocent utterance. Order. His roar was thunderous, silencing the laughter instantly. A vein throbbed in his temple. "This is not a place for fairy tales. Bailiff, remove this child." The two bailiffs immediately moved forward, their posture leaving no doubt they would not hesitate. Daniel, in the background, screamed in a voice hoarse with desperation, "Maya, please, get out of here." But Maya was not afraid. She stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Adrian's. As the two bailiffs were about to touch her shoulder, she did the one thing no one could have anticipated. Quick as a squirrel, she stepped forward, slipped past the wooden railing of the judge's bench, and placed her small, warm hand on Adrian's gnarled, white-knuckled hand clutching the armrest of his wheelchair. The unexpected touch made Adrian go rigid. It was not a touch of power. It was just flesh on flesh. But it had been so long since anyone had dared to touch him like that. Doctors, nurses, caregivers, they touched him with the cold professionalism of medicine. Lawyers, colleagues, they maintained a respectful distance. But this touch was different. It was innocent, direct, and completely fearless. His rage vanished, as if doused with cold water, replaced by a blank astonishment. The murmuring of the courtroom seemed to recede, fading into the distance, as if he and the girl were in a bubble of stillness. For the first time in years, he truly saw another person, not through the lens of a judge. He saw a pair of deep, clear eyes, and most importantly, in those eyes, there was no pity. Pity was the one thing he despised most. In the sudden stillness, Maya looked up. She didn't speak loudly, but whispered. A whisper meant only for him. "My father said you used to be a soldier. Soldiers never give up." Each word seeped into Adrian's mind like an icicle. A soldier. The two words were a forgotten password, unlocking a chamber of memories he had sealed off long ago. She squeezed his hand gently, a squeeze full of trust, and then asked the decisive question, the one that was the truth behind her impossible promise. "So why did you give up?" Boom! The question didn't ring out in the courtroom. It exploded in Adrian's head. He was no longer here. He was on the battlefield. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled his nostrils. Screams and gunshots deafened him. He saw himself dragging his best friend, David, who was seriously wounded. "Come on, Adrian. We're going home together," David had yelled, a smile still on his face despite the blood pouring out. Then came a flash of white, an explosion that tore the air apart. When he woke up, David was gone, and so were his legs. He couldn't save David. He couldn't save himself. He had failed. He had given up. Adrian snatched his hand away from Myers as if burned. He was gasping for air, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He bowed his head, not daring to look into her eyes, not daring to face the raw truth she had just thrown in his face. He wanted to scream, to cast out the ghost she had just summoned. And then, he felt it. A twitch, a faint tremor. His right big toe, which had been as lifeless as a piece of dead wood for 15 years, just twitched slightly. It was only an involuntary muscle spasm, a weak neurological reflex triggered by the extreme psychological shock. But to Adrian, it was like an earthquake shaking the very foundation of his world. The feeling was not hope, it was fear. A terrifying fear of feeling something in a place he had already accepted as dead. Hope is a dangerous thing, a sweet traitor. It can lift a person to the heavens, but it can also plunge them into a deeper hell, where disappointment gnaws at their very bones. Adrian Cole had promised himself he would never hope again. Paralysis was a certain truth, a painful but safe constant. He had built his entire life around it. But the twitch of his toe, it was like a stubborn sapling, determinedly pushing through the thick concrete of despair he had poured for years. It didn't bring joy. It brought a sharp, jabbing pain, the ache of something long dead suddenly stirring back to life. Soldiers never give up. Myers' voice echoed in his mind, not as an accusation, but as a bugle call from a distant past. A fierce battle raged inside Adrian, more brutal than any he had ever fought. A part of him screamed to cling to the safety of the wheelchair, to the familiar numbness. "Don't be a fool," it whispered. "You'll only fail again. You'll just make a fool of yourself." But another part, the soldier he thought had died with David on the battlefield, roared a command. It was not a choice. It was a mission. Adrian looked up. He didn't look at anyone. He placed both hands on the metal armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles white from the strain. The entire courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on him, waiting for something they didn't even know they were waiting for. He took a deep breath, channeling all his will, all his pain, all the fury of 15 years of giving up into a single action. The atrophied muscles in his thighs screamed in protest, sending sharp, needling pains to his brain. His spine felt like it was about to shatter. The wheelchair groaned in protest, as if it refused to let go of its master. And then, slowly, inch by inch, in the breathless silence of the entire courtroom, he stood up. He stood on his own 2 feet, shaking, unsteady, like an old building about to collapse in an earthquake. But he was standing. Sweat poured off him, blurring his vision. The world tilted. A collective gasp swept through the room like a wave. This time, there was no laughter. Someone let out an inarticulate cry. Someone else raised a hand to their mouth, their disbelief etched on their face. The clerk dropped his pen on the floor, creating a dry click. Daniel Cross fell to his knees, his hands covering his face, tears streaming through his fingers. The courtroom erupted into an impossible chaos, a pandemonium of utter astonishment. Adrian raised a hand, a gesture of authority despite his trembling body. "Order!" His voice was hoarse from the effort, but it was enough to bring back the silence. He was breathing heavily, holding onto the railing of the bench to keep from falling. The shock and exhaustion nearly overwhelmed him, but something else was rising inside. Clarity. The bitter fog that had clouded his mind for years seemed to dissipate, blown away by the internal storm he had just weathered. He sat back down, not in defeat, but to regain his strength. His body was exhausted, but his mind was strangely lucid. The prosecutor, still stuttering in amazement, tried to bring the court back to order. "Your Honor, despite this astonishing event, the evidence against the defendant has not changed." That statement brought Adrian back to reality. He looked down at the file on his desk. The letters, the numbers, were all the same. But this time, with an unlocked mind, he looked at them with different eyes. The eyes of a soldier seeking the truth, not a pre-programmed machine of judgment. Adrian looked at the prosecutor, a faint, tired but sharp smile appearing for the first time. The truth? For 15 years, I have sat here, believing the truths you present on paper. I forgot how to find it for myself. He slapped his hand down on the file. But today, someone reminded me. A soldier doesn't just fight with a gun, he fights with his eyes. And he saw it, clear as day, a small detail he had previously ignored because of his prejudice. A contradiction in the timeline of the arrest. It was blatantly illogical, a foolish error only made by those overconfident that no one would double-check. "Bring me the witness's interrogation transcript," Adrian ordered, his voice now steady and commanding. With his new perspective, Adrian re-examined the case. He no longer trusted what was pre-written. He questioned, he analyzed, he connected the dots with a terrifying sharpness. The witness's testimony began to crack under his questions. The evidence was full of holes. The elaborate setup was slowly exposed. Daniel Cross was just a pitiful pawn, thrown out to cover for the real masterminds. Finally, after nearly an hour of intense scrutiny, Adrian looked directly at Daniel. Then he braced himself and stood up again. This time, although still trembling, he stood straighter, his back no longer hunched under the weight of the past. He picked up the gavel. After reviewing all the evidence, the court finds this case shows clear signs of a blatant setup, he declared, his voice ringing through the room. "Daniel Cross, you are innocent." He paused, then continued, each word a hammer blow. "This court grants you your immediate freedom, and this court owes you an apology." Bang! The gavel came down. This time, it was not the sound of punishment. It was the sound of justice restored. It not only saved Daniel, but also shook the entire investigation, forcing the authorities to re-examine the case from scratch and target the true culprits. His first steps in 15 years were the steps of justice. The gavel of justice still echoed in the air as the bailiff approached and unlocked Daniel Cross's handcuffs. The clang of metal sounded dry and out of place. Daniel was still in a daze, looking down at his free hands as if they didn't belong to him. He had braced himself for a sentence of many years, for separation from his daughter, for a dark future. He was completely unprepared for this. Maya burst into sobs, not of fear, but of profound relief. She ran into her father's arms, and Daniel fell to his knees, clutching his daughter as if she were the only real thing in the world. They held each other, their tears of reunion running down their cheeks and mingling. The entire courtroom watched in silence, not a word spoken, as if they were afraid of breaking the sacred moment. Hand in hand, they rose and walked away from the defendant's railing. As he passed the judge's bench, Daniel hesitated and bowed to Adrian, a nod full of gratitude and respect. "Your Honor, I don't know what to say. Thank you." Maya stopped for a second. She didn't say much, just looked at Adrian, who was holding onto the table to stay upright, his legs still trembling after the extraordinary effort. Then she said a simple sentence, not to the powerful judge, but as if to a friend who had just found his way back home. "Now you can walk. But please walk toward the light." With that, she smiled, a radiant smile that lit up her whole face, then took her father's hand and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy oak door closed behind them. The commotion vanished, the tension dissipated. Only Adrian remained, alone in the silent room, among the empty pews and scattered papers. His last bit of strength drained away, the steely will that had held him up now loosened. He sank back into his familiar wheelchair. But the feeling this time was completely different. It was no longer a prison. It was no longer a part of him. It was just a chair, a place to rest. He looked down at his hand, where Maya's had been. The warmth seemed to linger, a fragile but real connection. Then he looked out. Through a broken window pane, A brilliant streak of golden sunlight shone in, illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the air. That was the light the girl had spoken of, the light of hope, of truth, of forgiveness, and he understood that his journey had only just begun. Standing up was just a moment. Walking was a long and arduous process. A few months later, the scene shifted to a completely different setting, a bright, sun-drenched physical therapy room with cream-colored walls and a clean, polished wooden floor. Gone was the grim, decaying atmosphere of the old courtroom. The air here was filled with the smell of massage oil and a positive energy, the energy of effort and recovery. Adrian, in simple workout clothes, was holding onto a metal parallel bar. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dampening his graying hair. He was learning to walk, one step at a time, slow and difficult. With each lift of his foot, his whole body trembled with the effort, his muscles screaming as they relearned a task they had forgotten for 15 years. "That's excellent, Mr. Cole. Keep your hips steady, just one more step," a young physical therapist encouraged, his voice full of support. Adrian gritted his teeth, focusing all his will on his legs. He lifted his right foot, it felt heavy as lead, and placed it forward. He was breathing hard, but he didn't stop. He was no longer the powerful judge, nor the fallen soldier. He was just a man learning to walk again. "This is hard," he said, a strained breath mixed with a hint of humor. "Turns out, exposing a lying prosecutor is easier than this." The therapist laughed. "You're doing great. Tomorrow will be a little easier. Just trust the process." Adrian nodded, holding onto the bar and looking out the large window where the sun was shining brightly. "Trust the process," he mumbled, as if to himself. "Yes, this time, I won't give up." After completing his walk, he held onto the bar, gazing out the large window at the warm sunlight and lush green trees. And for the first time in 15 years, a smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a bitter smirk or a forced grin to hide his pain. It was a genuine, resolute, and hopeful smile. The smile of a man who had walked through darkness and found the light not at the end of the road, but right on the journey he was taking. The journey toward the light continued, and he would never give up again.